Good evening, folks. It's Pastor Robert Johnson. It is a delight to be with you tonight. I am so excited about this discussion tonight. We're doing a two-night online seminar, if you want to call it, online conversation about race and about healing the racial wounds and the racial divide in America. And I have two guests on with me tonight. Of course, our very own from St. Mark, Pastor Yolanda Oliver is on with us. And our special guest is Dr. Shana Mashego. And I'm going to let her do a better pronunciation of her name in just a second. But we are so delighted to have her on. I'm going to tell you more about her. We're going to spend a little time kind of telling our story and talking about things that we're engaged in, other things that we're doing. And when we get to that time, you'll learn more about her. But I want to welcome you all to tonight. I want to welcome you, Pastor Yolanda. Thank you for being on.
Thanks for having me.
And Dr. Shana
Mashego. Yes. It is a delight to be with you tonight. I'm very excited.
Thank you for being on. It is a delight to have this conversation. We had an amazing conversation the other day. We've been connected and following each other from a distance, really, for a few years now, and finally got connected. And I am just so impressed and so excited about what you're doing and what God is doing through you. And so I'm delighted about our conversation tonight. So folks, we're going to spend 2 nights together, tonight and tomorrow night. We're asking for 90 minutes of your time. And I know that's a lot, particularly on a Friday night and a Saturday night, to ask you for 90 minutes on either one of those nights. Though you've worked all week and we're asking for that time. But I think that the issue of race is so important in America right now. And it is an issue that's on the table. We've got an open door that we have not really had in my lifetime. I'm 54, and this is the first time I remember. So I was born I was born in the midst of the civil rights movement, but was not, by the time I had an awareness of myself and started school, the civil rights movement had passed. And so in my lifetime, this is the first time that I've seen America wholeheartedly and across the nation really be awakened and have a sense of consciousness about racism in our country. So we have an open door. We have an opportunity that if we engage in the right way, if we engage in conversations and actions, that we can lead to positive change. So I know we're asking for a total 3 hours, 90 minutes tonight, 90 minutes tomorrow night, but I think 3 hours out of your lifetime is not much to ask if it will make an impact in changing the destiny of this nation and changing your destiny and changing your experience of racism in America. So again, to these two outstanding ladies, thank you all for being on with me tonight. We will also hope to have Dr. Reverend Rachel Pryor, who's a graduate of Princeton Theological Seminary and works with me on the board of Kansas Interfaith Action. We'll hope to have her on tonight. She's going to pop in and out and listen in and try and give some feedback to us. And so we look forward to having her on. We also look forward to your comments. We want this to be interactive. So Dr. Shana and I have planned the night, and we have some things that we're hoping to communicate with you, but we also want to hear from you. So if you'll post your comments, and Pastor Yolanda and some other persons on our media team from St. Mark are watching, and they will share those comments and make us aware of what you're saying, because we want to hear from you. We want to hear your hearts. We want to make sure that you are gathering and you're hearing and appropriating and understanding what we're saying, and that it's making sense, because we really want tonight and tomorrow night to make a difference in your life. I want to thank St. Mark United Methodist Church for allowing Pastor Yolanda and I to be in these kinds of formats. We're ministering to the local congregation, but we're also ministering to our city. And we're trying to also use this time of quarantine to reach beyond the boundaries of Kansas and to reach a national market in some ways, to take the gospel of Jesus Christ as it is manifested through St. Mark, to take that gospel to people who can't get to us physically. So again, welcome to tonight. It is July 10th, 2020. We're in the midst of a quarantine and a global pandemic. And one of the blessings of that is that folks are quarantined, and they're not able to get out. So they're looking for other things to do. And so a lot of people are doing this kind of learning, they probably would not have done before. So I want to go back to my guests, and I would like to again introduce them and just give them an opportunity to make an introductory statement, and then we will talk about our purpose for tonight and tomorrow night. We have a clear purpose and some clear goals that we hope to achieve over the next 2 nights. As we're preparing to do that, I want to invite you to tag some folks, let them know what's going on. Start a watch party from your own Facebook profile. Invite some folks in so that they can participate and hear this conversation. It is going to be an amazing conversation. Our special guest is so knowledgeable and so clear in her thinking about the issue of race. And so we are going to really be blessed by her insights and her expertise. And so again, Doctor, welcome to this platform tonight. You want to have some initial statements you'd like to make?
Well, I just want to make one statement, if it's okay. I'll just read something that I posted on yesterday, and that was, true democracy cannot live inside of a racist system. Systemic racism is a system of policies that restrict the movement and opportunities of particular people groups while giving overarching power and authority to one supreme people group. The only way to truly change a racist system is to either remove the racists who perpetuate the system or change their hearts.
Wow. What a great opening statement. Doctor, would you say more? You're doing a deal through YouTube, as a matter of fact. Would you say a word about what that is? And then we want to direct people to that, so that is a resource that's already posted. It's available through YouTube. Would you tell us about that, please?
Sure. So I have a channel called American Racism Got Questions. And on that YouTube channel, I'm literally giving lectures about the origins of racism in America. Actually, you cannot really talk about America without talking about racism, because the entire system of the country was built upon a racialized capitalist foundation. So in order for people to understand how the racist motivation of this capitalist system was created, you have to dig into the origins a bit so that they have factual information. So I'm an ethnic anthropologist. I study ethnic groups and historical, cultural, all of the kinds of dates and facts and those kinds of things. Anthropologists are more excited about the origin of things and how things began, rather than the symptoms of those origins, because once you understand the origin of something, then you can crack open the symptoms and really understand how to change them. So American Racism Got Questions is the name of my YouTube channel. It's very new. I only have 6 episodes available. But the reason I started the channel was because I started getting, as soon as we witnessed the death of George Floyd, I started getting copious amounts of questions from previous white church members about what they could do to become allies, and also what we could do as a people group to help them to understand what their place was in the solution. That was the gist. Those were the gist of the questions. I was also met by several who believed that this was not a race issue. And so I wanted to make sure that I had a platform where I could answer those questions from an anthropological standpoint, so that I could give them dates, facts, and figures that would help them to understand that this is indeed a race problem.
So would you say a quick word about how the study of anthropology gives you a different insight into the issue and history of race, as opposed to a historical perspective, or as opposed to maybe a sociological perspective? What are the unique insights that we will experience from you tonight, as a result of you being an anthropologist?
Well, the beauty of anthropology is that you're combining all of those elements, Pastor Johnson. It's a beautiful body of work that you create as an anthropologist when you look at issues. Because what you're doing is you're looking at the socio-cultural effects of a people group upon those people that are in that group along with them. So in other words, you're looking for the reasons why people have treated others the way they have and why they've built the systems that they've built. So what's interesting about American culture and being able to get down deep into the roots of the issues, the symptoms that we're seeing now, is that so much of what we've been taught about America globally, not only those of us who live here in America, but globally, America is seen as this country that is without flaw.
Mm-hmm.
So the first thing you're trying to do is you're trying to get in, because obviously there are flaws. Otherwise, we wouldn't be seeing the symptoms we're seeing. So the goal is to get down deep into the theories related to why we're here, and then figure out which of those theories can actually be supported by factual information.
Awesome. So, Pastor Yolanda, you have an initial statement you want to make, and I do want to say to Pastor Yolanda and to our audience, she's my partner in ministry, and I'm so delighted to work with her. And those of you that work with me know that I will call on you at the last minute. So Pastor Yolanda reached out to me and said, "What do you need? How can I invite you?" So I said, "I need you to come on the broadcast." So I want to thank her for doing that, but Dr. Shana and I are to some degree have lived in the South. I lived in the deep South. I'm a native Mississippian, and I'll say more about that in a minute. Dr. Shana and I met through Texas, but Pastor Yolanda, you've lived in the Midwest as well as other places. You've lived overseas, but you've lived in the Midwest. Any initial thoughts from you on the issue of racism and what's going on in our country right now?
I think I can say that just from personally, I'm exhausted.
Yeah.
I'm emotionally overwhelmed, and I'm trying to, I think like many people, process what I'm feeling on an individual level and trying not to be the spokesperson for every Caucasian person that I might have a relationship with right now.
Mm-hmm.
I think I'm beyond trying to be kind and understanding,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm trying to get back to my heart.
Mm-hmm.
Your heart will guide you to do things that your head will lead you wrong to do. So I'm trying to get back to the heart of what I can do as a human being,
Mm-hmm.
first,
Mm-hmm.
as a lover of God,
Mm-hmm.
and as a woman
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
in this climate.
Mm-hmm.
I think everywhere we go right now, we are sitting on a ticking time bomb.
Yes. So true.
And I've never felt that before.
Never felt that before.
Dealt with racism in different ways. I have 8 children. A large amount of them are young Black men. So I've always lived with a fear in one way or another of what could happen to them because of the color of their skin or the way that they actually dress or the way that they speak. And to see it coming out, being played out in the way that it's being, I haven't slept.
Wow. And I don't know, at some point, Pastor Yolanda, being the mother of 8 children, has had all kinds of experiences with her children in a racist society. And I don't know how comfortable she may be on tonight or tomorrow night to share some of that. But we will see what happens with that. And it's so interesting. I'm so glad you brought up the issue of not only from the perspective of a woman, but from of a Black person, but from the perspective of a woman. I was reviewing some history today, Dr. Shana, in preparation for our conversation. And very early on, and we may get a chance to cover this, there was a lady by the name of Anne Hutchinson in the Massachusetts Bay Colony who was challenging the religious aristocracy because they wanted to have only certain people who were able to interpret the Bible, interpret the religion and they wanted to control that so that then they could define how this new, what they call the new world, what it was going to be. And so she came in and she was given these different interpretations, and they literally felt the need as a group of people, white men in power, to come in and shut her down, so to make it clear that women were not to bring their interpretations. And then, because if you allow them, then everybody gets to interpret scripture, and then we lose power. And we're already getting into the history of how Christianity was used to help suppress freedom and suppress thinking and suppress people's assertion of their humanity. But we'll come back to that. I want to let me give our stated purpose, and then we're going to start digging into. I want to spend a little time and go back and just kind of each one of us kind of talk about our history and where we are. Pastor Yolanda, you've done a little bit of that already. We'll do a little bit more. Our stated purpose is to explain. This is very ambitious. It's very ambitious, but I believe we can. I believe that you gotta try, right? Whatever happens, we're going to give it our best shot. But our purpose is to explain how America got constructed as a racist society, and to provide practicable strategy for breaking the chains of personal and systemic racism. And our hopeful takeaways are, number one, that we want to equip our listeners to be able to not only be active non-racist, but to actually be active anti-racist. And we'll talk more about what that means. There's a difference between being a non-racist and being anti-racist. And then we want to equip our listeners to be positive and healing participants in both in the American story, but also in the global human community. And in order to be a healing presence, you got to deal with your racism. You got to deal with your sexism. You got to deal with your classism. And in America, they've all been tied together. But the root of it, the most destructive of those isms, has been the racism, in my opinion. And that's certainly not to diminish the classism that's based in economics, of course. But that got empowered in America by race and by racism. So those are our goals. We will put those up. Those are very ambitious. So we hope to, we want to tell the story. And that's what Dr. Shana has already talked about. That's what she does so well. How did America become a racist nation? How did that begin? And we're going to go back to the very beginning. We're going to talk about how that started. And then we're going to talk about all the times in American history where that narrative and that agenda got stamped and affirmed and more deeply cemented into our national identity, from redlining to Jim Crowism to lynching to police brutality. All of these things were ways that America cemented what happened from the very beginning of our nation. So how do we get constructed to become a racist nation? And then how do we deconstruct? How do we deconstruct? And how do we heal the wounds and the divide? And then how do we equip people? How can we equip people so that they become healing presences in both the American story and in the global community? All right, so that's very ambitious. That's where we are. We're going to jump into it, and we're going to see what we do. I want to take a moment now and have each one of us to kind of tell the story that has brought us to the experiences that have brought us to this point. So, Shana, let's start with you, and then let's kind of tell folks what a lot of people don't know. We didn't get a chance to do that. We'll hopefully do it tomorrow night. Pastor Yolanda asked me, who's the psalmist for tonight? I said, we don't have one. We've got to jump right in. Maybe we'll do something tomorrow night. But kind of tell folks what you've been doing over the past 15, 20 years.
Ooh, 15, 20 years. Okay. So I graduated from an HBCU, thanks be to God, because by the time I got to college, I had no clue who I was. I had no form of identity related to my Blackness. I was a ping pong kid throughout elementary school to middle school to high school. And what that meant was I was a part of a desegregation program. And the way that program worked was I was the last of 7 children. So all 6 of my other siblings had gone to neighborhood schools. They knew the community, everyone, all of the teachers knew my family. We were a part of a very, very vibrant Creole Catholic church. My parents are both full-blooded Louisiana Creoles, speak French, Creole food, the whole 9 yards. So we were a very, very close and connected part of our community. And I was the one of the 7 children who was then transported across town to be a part of a desegregation process. And in the process of that, by the time I finished high school, I had gone to 7 schools, whereas my siblings had only gone to 3 schools. So the trauma of desegregation was a bit taxing for a child who started off from the age of 9 all the way through to high school, going to a part of town where I knew no one, my family didn't know anyone, and it was extremely segregated. So I went to all white neighborhoods to go to their schools where there was a small percentage of Black kids there, and we were taught by white teachers. So by the time I got to Texas Southern University in Houston, Texas, I was a mess. I had no idea who I was as a Black person. I had no idea about how beautiful my heritage was and my culture was. And I was in the midst of what I saw as giants in relationship to African American history and study. So I did my undergraduate degree and my master's degree, both in classical voice, and my master's degree also accompanied by research. I found that I had both sides of my brain worked pretty well, and I could do both art as well as research. And I became very interested in the composers that I was singing and their backgrounds and their sociology. And I realized that there was an area of study called ethnomusicology, where you study the ethnic groups of musicians, music makers, and their societal histories and origins, kind of like cultural anthropologists. So I decided for the doctoral degree, I would do a double emphasis. So I went to the University of Arizona, where they allowed me to do those double emphasis, and I did classical voice as well as anthropological research in ethnic groups, which they called ethnomusicology at the time. And even still, there was another identity that I had to take on. And I realized at that point in my life that there was this uniqueness about Black people, that we had to figure out ways to not only be in and be accepted in several different spaces, but we also had to figure out how to navigate through all of the spaces that we're required to be in. I also realized at that point in my life that there was not necessarily any knowledge of the fact that I had a different ethnicity inside of my Blackness. In other words, there was not enough respect for Black people as a whole for me to even be able to be seen as someone who was not necessarily your average African American, because I was Creole born, which is a completely different subculture inside of Blackness. But that wasn't seen because of the lack of respect given to Black peoples. I was the only African-American woman in the program. And it was very, very clearly seen that there were lots of racist ideas and racist policies enacted upon me that were a bit different than my white counterparts. So that led me to jumping in head first, being the best like we do, working really hard to make sure that we are the best of the best in that space, and then figuring out a way to navigate a space for myself. And I found that if I researched African American women who composed large orchestral works, I could then expose those who were on my committee to the beauty of our culture and the variances within our culture. And so that has translated into me creating a hymn ensemble where we preserve hymns and travel. I've traveled with a piano quintet, preserving hymns. I've just decided that I will not be restricted in relationship to artistry and research. So when George Floyd was killed, I decided to take the knowledge that I had as a researcher to try to get to the very bottom root issue of the problem that we have in America. And why was it, the question that I led with was, why was it that the white police officer had to kill the Black man who was already in a prone position on his stomach, handcuffed? What was the reason for him feeling that he had the authority and the power to kill that man? And so I pulled that in, put on my researcher hat, and here we are today.
Wow. What a journey. So what's very interesting, by the way, you remind me so much, your journey reminds me, Paul Robeson, the great singer and an African-American scholar who was both a theatrical performer, but before he died, was actually doing some research on the connection between ancient Chinese, Asian languages and ancient African languages, and was actually making a connection, showing some connections there, that there was some ancient connections there that had been lost, and he was making those connections. So just profound intellect. So glad to have you on. You all see now we have on Reverend Rachel Pryor. Rachel, thank you so much for coming on. Rachel, just take a moment and share what the work you're doing, and just tell where you went to school. I've shared with people you're a graduate of Princeton Seminary, but tell us how you got engaged. So Rachel was on the board of KIFA, Kansas Interfaith Action. They invited me to be a part of that board. We do political advocacy in the state of Kansas on issues of climate justice, healthcare, racial justice, economic justice, as well as criminal justice. So those are the issues we focus on. Rachel was already on that board, graduate of Princeton Seminary, a pastor. Rachel, just take a couple of minutes and talk about how you got involved in the work of social justice, and what's clicking for you right now on the issue of race that's really pressing in our country right now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. First, I just want to say I'm so honored to be here tonight. Thank you so much for the invitation, Pastor Johnson, and I'm definitely I'm here to learn in this group, and to listen primarily, and hopefully offer some perspective when it's appropriate. I also want to apologize if there are any delays, or if you're having any difficulty hearing at any point. I'm in an area of far northern Michigan that's very rural and doesn't have broadband internet access, so I'll do the best I can. I grew up in a small denomination, the United Church of Christ, which has been a denomination with a historical commitment to a broader inclusion of people who have in some other denominations, especially predominantly Caucasian denominations, people who have been silenced, voices that have not been included. The UCC has been earlier to include, although I wanted to also be quick to say, far from perfect. We're still very much a predominantly white denomination, and we grapple with that history just like any of our Protestant denominations that are predominantly white. And however, the blessing in that to me was that I grew up in a congregation that did take that role seriously, that did talk about race in a way that I didn't hear in other places. And so for me, as I grew up, I went to the University of Michigan. Like you said, I went to Princeton Seminary. And it was a constant sort of discovery of how little that conversation was happening in other places. So something that I took for granted and honestly didn't pay that much attention to because it was just happening. And I thought this was happening everywhere. I started to take more and more notice about how it wasn't happening. And of course, I wasn't the only one. I'm very much an amateur, and I look up to the greats in the field who are leading the way in all of these conversations. So once again, when we moved to Kansas about 6 years ago, we weren't sure for a while how long we would be here. And once it became clear that we were in this state to stay for a while, I knew I had to be a part of these conversations from a faith perspective, from a civil perspective, from the perspective of human rights and humanity. And so I was invited because I showed up. And that is so often the story, that if people just show up, the invitations are there. The work, there's so much work to be done. The harvest is plentiful, but the laborers are few. And so if you show up, there's work. You can be invited, especially if you're willing to show up and listen. And that can be difficult. We know that can be very difficult for white people. I hope I'm not illustrating that too much here tonight. I'm about to finish up here. But I do believe that the model that we hear in the church, the model that we have from our faith, a model of service, and especially a model of humility, that there is that's a very fruitful direction for discussion right now, especially in historically white churches. That if we can dig a little deeper into that humility and come to these conversations, show up to be a participant, but a listening participant, a thoughtful participant, someone who's willing to be critiqued, someone who's willing to sit with some of the grief, especially that Pastor Yolanda was talking about earlier, how exhausted people are. I think that's where I'm trying to be, to speak when asked to speak, but also just to sit in these places where there's so much pain and there's so much grief. And it's very easy for white people, and unfortunately for the white church, to say, this doesn't really affect us and we don't really need to be here. And I hope that's what faithful leaders in the white church can really be committed to not turning away from the conversation. So thank you so much. It's really, truly a privilege to be here. And I'm looking forward to everything I know I'm going to learn in these next 2 evenings.
Hey, thank you so much for being on, Rachel. Thank you so much for being on. Yolanda, you want to take a moment and just kind of share a little of your background? You've lived in, I believe, Germany. You were a military kid. So how has what things have shaped you in terms of where you are with the issue of racism and how we live that out in America, how we deal with that?
I think that as a military brat, as we are so affectionately called, I've been sheltered for such a long time in my youth, being overseas and usually being the only one in the room that we've learned that so many of us are. I learned to accept it. I learned to, there would normally not be anyone around that looked like me. Now, I didn't necessarily experience any racism in elementary school overseas, but coming back to the United States was culture shock for me in more ways than one. Not only from an educational perspective, where overseas it was okay for me to be smart, it was okay for me to aspire to want more and to do more. But coming back to the States, I was in classrooms with other people that looked like me, that didn't necessarily have the same privileges that I had been able to have while I was overseas. So I've always battled with this feeling of not belonging, no matter where I was, whether it was at church, whether it was at school, whether it now is in the workplace, that so often I feel like I'm alone. And I found that I'm not the only one that feels that way. We live in a world to where we only usually allow one of us to exceed or excel. We reach our quota when there's one of us, and that's all we are willing to deal with. And I've come to a point now to where, and I think I've been guilty of being the only one at the table and being okay with that. And I'm no longer okay with that now. So if I'm at the table, I'm going to bring a few more people with me. And if you can't, it was a very wise person as I'm weeping and I get this text that says, you are perfect just as you are. And if there's anyone, whether they're a paying job, whether it's in a relationship, if they can't accept you just as you are, you should not give them the benefit of your presence. So I think a lot of us have lived in fear because we've grown accustomed to the privileges and all of the nice things that we enjoy, that we're willing to, I don't want to use the word, but I'm just going to say it, sell out for the things that we've been afforded. And I'm no longer willing to sell out. I would rather live in a car happy than having to continuously deal with people that don't see me, that don't see my children, that don't value my input or my intellect, and they tolerate me. The day for that is over. I've learned in some of these conversations, and I so appreciate you, Pastor Johnson, for allowing me to be part of them, because just like other panelists, I've been on and I've been learning, I've been listening and I've been learning. And there was a post that I saw a couple of weeks back where people are really talking about George and how we are upset about it. And I too am upset, but we're focusing so much on George, but there were so many more that came before him. We still haven't got over Emmett Till. And as I'm speaking to some of my neighbors who have the understanding that because I'm their next door neighbor, they believe that I've never experienced racism. And so when they come to my door because they want to have these chats, they're not expecting to hear some of the things that we enlighten them to. It's unfortunate that in 2020, I still have to show my 16-year-old son, Emmett Till, to let him know that if that's blonde-haired, blue-eyed girl is who you choose to like, this is what you might have to deal with. So I think as I'm aging, as I'm coming into Yolanda, as I'm coming into my womanhood, not just my sisterhood, I am becoming offended, and I'm doing my best again to get back to my heart and to give people passes, because as I said before we came on, the caucasity of some people is really beginning to get under my skin. And if I don't get back to love, I might be pressing on a crossroads that I really don't want to, I don't want to experience. I don't want to become what it is that I am so trying to change. Yeah. And that's what ends up happening to a lot of us. So, you know, we speak about our counterparts that don't see us, that we become so angry and so hurt that we begin to act like what it is that we don't want to be treated as, if that makes sense. So makes sense. I'm so excited to hear from Dr. Shana, and I'm so excited that you are here, Reverend Pryor, just be in an uncomfortable situation, because we know it's not a comfortable place to be in, and not many people are willing to do it. You know, we're still doing the niceties and passing each other in the store and just nodding our heads at one another as if we're not just dealing with a pandemic, but we are on the precipice of a war, a human war, that if we don't get on top of it soon, there won't be any looking back. So I appreciate your boldness, your courage to come and sit on this panel and to hear. And I hope, if I can add one more thing onto our list, is that you'll take these conversations back into some of the rooms that we don't have the privilege to sit in. I think
we will really empower people. Am I mute? Yeah, I'm unmuted. That we will really empower people so that they will be able to go back to their workplaces and to their churches and communities and begin to lead conversations and lead activities that begin to really heal the wounds of the racial wounds in our nation. So let me say a brief word about what has shaped me, just very quickly. I grew up in the deep South of Mississippi. I grew up in a community that was born in 66, started school in 72. And I grew up in a community where racism was everywhere, but everybody knew their rules. So it was not violent. It was not There was not a lot of ugliness to it, but everybody knew their role. So the Black folks kind of stayed in their place, and as long as that happened, then it seemed to be a very peaceful community. And I and a lot of my African American classmates, when we came of age and came to a sense of awareness, we realized, hey, we were living in a state where a couple hours up the highway, Emmett Till happens. A couple of hours in a different direction, Shana, Goodman, and Cheney happened. That's the story of the three guys that came, college kids that came to help with voter registration, who were kidnapped and killed, and their bodies were found in some river. And we heard those stories all the time. So we grew up. So when I'm in a community, and Yolanda, you'll catch this. When I'm in a community where everything seems to be fine, but I know that the mechanisms of racism are all around us. I know that that's only because people have learned to stay in their place, and they've learned to go along to get along. And so what I'm so excited about is that the next generation, my daughter's generations, we are not having that. We are not having it. As a matter of fact, my oldest daughter, she and her fiance said to me the other night in a conversation, why do we have to, we don't want to explain racism to white people anymore. Like, that's not if you want to do that, go for it. But that we don't see a need to do that anymore. And so, of course, I'm coaching them through that it's not just about what you experience, but it's about us working together to build a human community so that we can begin to transcend the barriers of race and then engage in our racial identity and our ethnic identity in a healthy way. So I grew up there. The two things that have most impacted me about race. So in that environment, I had a childhood pastor who was he was kind of the Martin Luther King Jr. of our community. He led nonprofit organizations to help provide food, take care of senior citizens, provide Head Start programs for kids who couldn't afford to go to kindergartens, all this kind of stuff. And then when issues arose in the community, the Black community came to him for leadership. So there was an occasion where a young man was killed by a guy there in Columbia, and he spoke out about it. And he was threatened by the local KKK. And so I'll never forget that Sunday morning, he said to us, don't worry about him, and that he was going to go home and go to sleep. And he was trusting God. And the men of the church got together and stood guard outside of his home with their shotguns and said, nobody's going to bother our pastor. And somewhere over the night, though, that the KKK drove by the church and shot into the church, and the bullet hole from that shot is still there. So that's part of the story. When we tell the story of Friendship Baptist Church, we show that hole to kids, that's a reminder of what happened. So that impacted me, watching my pastor stand courageously against racism and against racial oppression and white supremacy, and without fear, seeing him do that. And then the second thing that has had the most impact is being a Black male. So Yolanda, you talked about being a Black female. I can't tell you that as a Black male, that very little has impacted me as much negatively as the experience of being treated as a threat everywhere I go. And it doesn't matter whether I'm in academia, it doesn't matter whether I'm in the mall, if I'm with my United Methodist clergy friends, even when they know me, there's always a bit of hesitation because of this constant fear of a Black male. And it doesn't matter, I used to think maybe if I looked clean enough, if I talked right, if I did, but when I saw the way this nation treated Barack Obama, he was as good of a man of any color as you can get, and people hated him. And so that was part of the reason that hurt Black men so much, because it was like, if they can't accept Obama, we have no chance. So then you come to 4 years later, and we watch a video of a police officer with his knee on the neck of a Black man who's crying out for his mama. And so for Black men in particular, we saw that episode as a physical manifestation of the hatred of this country, of Black people in general, and of Black men in particular. And so that's why those are things that have kind of shaped me. I've been engaged in social work, social activism, and trying to address racism for a long time, but those are the issues that have shaped me. But this is the time of awakening. And so I'm more engaged more now than ever, because I think a door is open. And I think an opportunity has come for us to really engage in a way that we haven't in my 54 years of living. So I'm excited. We're going to go now, and I want to start telling the story of how this nation got constructed in racism. So Dr. Shana, can I take a moment? And I just want to read for our viewers. I want to get them excited about some of the questions that we hope to answer over the next 2 nights. So here's just some questions that we're going to go after. Can America survive without racism? How did America get constructed as a racist nation? When did racism begin in America, and why? What role did Christianity play in stamping racism into America's DNA? Why do some white people relentlessly deny the reality of racism in America? Why do some Black and brown Americans relentlessly deny the reality of racism? What's the difference between racism and discrimination? What is white supremacy? What is white privilege? What specific practices has America engaged in historically that have cemented racism into the American heritage? Why is America experiencing a new awakening to the problem of racism right now? If racism is a reality, how do you explain the attitudes and thoughts of Black people like Candace Owens, Chief Justice Clarence Thomas, Kanye West, depending on what day it is with Kanye, former NBA great Karl Malone, acclaimed physician and Secretary of Housing and Urban Development Ben Carson, and intellectuals like Thomas Sowell and Shelby Steele? How do you explain those folks? What's the historical relationship between policing and white supremacy? And then how can we free America from her racist loyalties? And should America pay reparations to Black Americans? Those are some of the questions we want to try to address as we go and review the history of racism in America, and then begin to provide a pathway forward. And let me tell you, when we get to the pathway forward, this is not just philosophy, it's not just theory, that Dr. Shana has really thought and studied and researched, and from what she shared with me, really has some clear, practicable strategies for how we move forward. And all of us as Christians, what we're going to end on place where she says that Jesus has to be a part of that. And we're just not talking about some ethereal, supernatural, emotional thing. We're talking about theologically, practically, and digging into the historical context of who he was and how he, according to the stories that are given to us in the Gospels, how, if we really embrace that, how that can empower those of us who are followers of Jesus Christ, of Jesus, how that can empower us to engage in this conversation. So Dr. Shana, let's ask the big question. Where does the story begin?
Well, the story is actually really old. And if you think about it, you have to take yourself all the way back to the Roman Empire. And so the concept of the Roman Empire was to divide and conquer. Now, the difference between the Roman Empire and other empires was that the Roman Empire somehow created this concept of global rule. They wanted to rule the world globally. And so even though the Roman Empire fell, the ideologies that were imparted in the mind of the Europeans stayed very well intact. And as a matter of fact, in 1444, when the Portuguese began the Atlantic slave trade, and I want to make sure that we hear that date, because somehow in America, we are fixated on the date of 1619 as the beginning of slavery. That is not an accurate date. The accurate date is 1444. That was the beginning of the Atlantic slave trade. And the Atlantic slave trade was started by the Portuguese. The Portuguese went into Africa, created relationships with African emperors, figured out ways to penetrate and then perpetuate this idea of these concepts of Roman empowerment over those particular emperors and empires, go in and take their captives, because you have to understand, Africa is a continent. So when you think about Africa and you think about sub-Saharan Africa, which is where the slave trade began from, right? The idea was there was a constant fight for territory. So you had an African empire that had a protected area of land. You had neighboring tribes and empires that were trying to expand their land gain because the land was very rich. It said that you could live on African soil and receive every benefit you could imagine. Precious stones, oil, anything you needed was in the soil. And so there was this need, there was this desire for territory in Africa. So what would happen is you'd have one empire that would then go to war with another. And after that war, there were captives that were taken in. Those captives would then become the captives of that empire. So what occurred was Arab slave trade had been going on for years before the Portuguese got involved. So at this point, what happened was the Portuguese realized that there was this idea of free labor that could be extracted from Africa, not only the precious stones and those things that they could go in and trade for, but also free labor, free sources of labor, just as the Arabs had been practicing. So what they did was they created relationships with the emperors so that they could somehow trade for their captives. Now we have to take note, and I said it earlier, but I want to mention it again. The idea of captivity, slavery in Africa, for most of the nations there was no practice of chattel slavery. Chattel slavery is only apparent in Egyptian culture related to the Israelites, and also in American culture related to the Atlantic slave trade. Those are the only two civilizations that are historically known for practicing chattel slavery, which means that you're born a slave. If your mother is a slave, you are a slave. Once you become enslaved, you are enslaved forever. That's chattel slavery. It's brutal and awful. And so the kind of practices that were occurring in these different African empires was not chattel slavery. The slaves, the captives that were a part of these empires were able to have land, they were able to marry, they were able to have families. It was very, very similar to the slavery practices that we hear of in the Gospels, when the kind of slavery that was occurring during the time that Jesus walked the earth. So what the Portuguese did was they realized that if they created alliances with these emperors, they could trade for the captives that had become captives of these various empires. They then infiltrated, pull these particular captives out of Africa, take them to Europe, and then they would become slaves in Europe. So once the colonies were established, that's when the idea of taking slaves from Africa now to the New World began, even before that, actually. But the New World, this idea of the New World, you have to remember, was also North and South America. So once the colonies were established, the first group of slaves that we know of who entered into chattel slavery in America were infiltrated into this country in 1619. Okay, so that's where that 1619 date comes from. But you have to remember, this practice had been occurring since 1444, when the Portuguese removed that very first group of Africans away from Africa and then transported them into Europe.
Now, Dr. Shana, so because you just said something very important, I just want to make sure, because I think this is one of the things we want people to grasp.
Sure.
Because one of the criticisms, one of the things that I often hear white people say in defense of slavery is that, well, Black people were enslaving themselves in Africa, but even before we started. And you're making a distinction between that form of slavery that happened in sub-Saharan Africa and the continent of Africa, and the chattel slavery that happened in America. Please slow down and review that one more time and just make the distinction between those two forms of slavery.
Most definitely. Very, very clear differences. And this is the other part that people really have to understand. Most of the time when Americans speak of Black people, they think about us in one group. So it's very difficult to then communicate the way empires worked in Africa, because they think of one group. They think of Africa as a country. And that's extremely problematic, Because then, well, yeah, now it can be said, oh, they were capturing their own people, where they weren't capturing their own people. These were neighboring tribes, just as we have varying countries within our continents. That's the way Africa was set up. It's a continent with several countries. So there were several empires. So what would happen was you had one empire that was strong, and you had another empire that was strong. And they both had rich soil and territory. They wanted to infiltrate and annex their property. So they wanted more land. So they would fight one another for the land. Okay. So in the process of war, there are captives. This is a normal thing. So the captives from whomever won the war became the captives, not property, but the captives of those empires.
Not property.
Not property. Property, the concept of property only sits inside of chattel slavery. Chattel slavery, you purchase a slave like you would purchase cattle. Chattel, cattle. It's the same. That's where the derivative comes from. So the idea was you were buying heads of slaves, just as you bought heads of cattle. That was not the case when it came to these empires that were at war with one another. That's the reason why their captives were allowed to marry and to have land and to build homes. They became a part of the empire. Now, they were seen as captives, and they were heavily protected because they had to ensure that they were protecting their territory from infiltration. But at the end of the day, that's how it began. So when the Portuguese, it started off, like I said, with the Arabs realizing this. Now, let me back up just a tiny bit, because in Europe, there had already been this ideology connected to Black skin. You have Shakespearean plays where Black people were depicted as criminalized or witches or evil. So this idea of Blackness being criminalized was a very old idea that had been taken from Arab culture, because in order to enslave a human, you have to dehumanize it. So that was the entire goal, was how do we dehumanize this particular people so that we can then enslave them? Racism always begins with a motivation. So anyway, the goal was, how do we then infiltrate, create relationships, and create alliances with these varying empires, so that as they receive captives, we're then able to trade for them? Well, now you have to remember, these were the descendants of Romans. So the whole goal was not how can we only work with this particular empire, but how can we dominate the continent? How can we dominate the continent for our gain? So what ended up happening was, as they created alliances with these particular empires, it became profitable for them to then take the captives, trade with the emperors, take the captives back to Europe, and then take those captives to the New World and receive payment for them. So it became a very profitable practice. So they literally perverted the entire system of captivity, war and captivity in Africa, and eventually they created allegiances with, overthrew those governments, and then in turn took them in as captives. So they enslaved many of the African slaves that were brought over to the New World were from royalty. They would overthrow an entire monarchy, remove not only the captives, but also those who were in power over that territory. So it became a rape of the continent. They began raping the continent, not only of their people, but also raping the continent of its precious goods, of its precious metals, anything that they could get their hands on. So eventually what happens is now you have between 6 to 7 million African slaves that were brought over from the continent of Africa into the New World. Okay, the question is, though, why was this the case? Because when the Europeans came to America to establish colonies, the goal was, how can we have two things: financial wealth and financial gain, and religious freedom, freedom from religious persecution. Those were the two goals for creating the colonies. We all know the story where, eventually they fought for their own independence, even from England. Even from, so the whole idea was freedom to make money and freedom to practice religion in the way that they wanted to. Okay. Well, in order to create a system of wealth, they had to oppress the Black slaves that they were bringing over. They had to oppress and restrict them strictly to labor that would then in turn give them wealth. So the indigenous Americans who were already in the New World, they didn't have the resiliency that African slaves did, nor were they as plenteous. And also indigenous people fought, they waged war, but they were very susceptible to illness as well. Whereas the African slaves, they realized that it was extremely profitable for them to use the African slave because the bodies were more resilient. So therefore, they were able to
Pause right there. So I'm trying to create an outline for our listeners. So we started in sub-Saharan Africa. Mm-hmm. We talked about the tribes that were living in normal human competition. They engage in war. When people engage in war, if you take people captive, that would happen. But then those people still they were able to own property.
Yes, very similar to the slavery practices that were happening in Jesus's day when Jesus was walking the earth. That's how slavery looked in Africa. It was not chattel slavery.
But something totally. So two things: the Portuguese and the Europeans, they violate those tribes and those people.
Yes,
even take some of the folks who are royalty into slavery, bring them to the New World, quote unquote New World, and place them into chattel slavery. Of course, we can deal with the Middle Passage and what happens with that, which was a horrible the migration from Africa to the New World and everything. How they were packed like short sardines. If you haven't gone to the African American Museum in DC, I want to encourage everybody. Every human being needs to go there so you can just see the story of the what's called the Middle Passage and how that happened. So this deep-seated racism and the oppression of Black humanity begins on another continent and it gets migrated here. But when it gets here, once they get on the boats of the Middle Passage, it becomes something horribly even worse and more demonic and just dark evil. And by the time you get to American soil, then it's something different. So let's pause right there and see if we have any comments from Rachel or from any of our guests who are listening, and then we will continue with the story. By the way, as we're waiting to see if there are any comments, actually, so people say 1619, but actually in 1513, you have the first settlement of Spanish conquistadors in Florida. That's right. And Georgia and the Carolinas, and then also in what is now New Mexico. And they do rebel because I believe it's 1601, there's this mass conversion of the natives, but then the natives are thinking, okay, well, we'll buy into this Catholicism, but we're going to keep doing what we do as well. And when the conquistadors see that, then they basically try to suppress their old religious practices, and they begin to engage in violent suppression of their religious practice. And a guy one of the natives, who was given the name Pope, by the way, pulled together about 200 natives, and they literally revolted against it and basically conquered them. And so they threw off Catholicism. Now, of course, Catholicism returns, but when they return with a willingness to accept the native practices of the people the religion that was already in place. So that's just part of that story. Rachel, you want any comments here? And then we're gonna keep. So we're. I don't know if Shana, you're gonna pick up with the middle passage, or we're now on American soil. But let me see if Rachel has any comment here.
The one thing I think is really important to pick up on is I really appreciated the way that Dr. Mashego said people came for the right to practice their religion in the way that they wanted to, not exactly for religious persecution. Sometimes that was the case. Sometimes people were being persecuted. Sometimes they were the persecutors. Sometimes they were these very exclusive groups, and they wanted to be more strict. And they were frustrated with the fact that the king, the emperor, the chancellor was not letting them be strict enough, was not forcing other people to be more strict in their religious expression. And so that's my inheritance. That's in the Congregationalist church. Some Congregationalists came over here because they were really frustrated with how lax the queen was, or how lax we had to be stricter here. We had to have better laws. We had to keep people in line. There was one right way to practice the faith. And so, another aspect, another part of my inheritance that I'm really proud of is that there was a strong streak of abolitionism in the Congregational church in New England. That was there. That's great. There are great stories about how that also informed a part of our history, and it meant a lot of different things depending on which abolitionist you were talking to. But in any case, it really goes back to something that Dr. Mashego talked about way at the very beginning, which is the idea of, I think you called it like the flawlessness of America. America is this flawless place, this flawless people. And that really connects in with that early religious expression of, we know the right way. We are this little heaven in this piece of earth that we came here for the freedom to create this, because we are flawless, because the revelation we have received is flawless. We are seeking flawlessness. And so that's going to come back around. And I know you're going to talk about it, but I just want to put that in there, not only to draw attention to it, but to point out, from the perspective of a white person and for the churches from the white tradition, that's such an important piece, and we often gloss over it. So I'm really looking forward, from your anthropology background, to hear even more about those connections and how all of those things tie together.
My God. So Rach, so let me make sure I'm here, because that is a huge piece of the story. That many of the people who came in the name of freedom of religious expression were some of the most really oppressive and self-righteous folks who came so that they could exert more control, and that they become a part of the originators of the American story, that mindset, and that those folks with that kind of disposition were a part of the people who helped begin the American story. That is so important. And as you were saying, that gets played out in multiple ways as the story goes on. That is so rich. Yes, my sisters, y'all are informing me. Come on, let's go. Let's roll, doctor. Come on, we're ready.
Can you highlight, Dr. Shana, again on the why? You said that the African slaves needed to be oppressed for
capital gain, money, power. So the entire American system, the system of capitalism that is built in this country, is based upon racist ideas, which are then filtered through and acted on through racist policies. So in order to truly address the issue, you have to understand the motivation. So the motivation, remember, 2 motivations.
Oh my God.
The freedom to be who you want to be related to your religion, religious freedom. You want to practice it the way you want to practice it, and financial gain. Those were the motivations for the creation of America. How were you going to gain financially, though? The way you were going to gain was you were going to create a system where there was a group who sat at the top of the system, who benefited from the labor of those who were subjected underneath the group. So the only freedom that the group underneath, the group at the top had, were the freedoms given to them by the group at the top. And all of the labor from the Black bodies that they captured, stole, kidnapped, and brought here, all of the labor, all of the benefit from that labor fed into the desire of the colonialist to create financial gain. This is what America is built upon. It is a racialized capitalist system.
As a matter of fact, you have 3 things that converged. That you have, of course, financial greed. That's one. You have racial superiority or racial supremacy. And then the piece that Rachel added, and then you have religious. Oh my God.
But the way it's the way they were communicated. See, the thing that's so interesting is that they used their religious freedom in order to drive. That is what energized the capitalist system. So their idea was, well, slavery is great because what we're doing is these people that we've brought here, they're only 60% human.
Right.
So they had to dehumanize the slave. They're only 60% human. But if we convert them to Christianity, we are doing them a huge service because they never would have received Christianity in their particular country, which was completely false because we know that the story
is birthed in on the continent.
Yes, I mean, come on, you know. So we were not void of Christianity on the continent of Africa, but that was a part of the racist idea, which then created the racist action. So when you start to talk about racism, the way racism works is you're classifying a group of people according to physical appearance. It's the classification of a group of people according to their physical appearance. But in order for American capitalism to work, they had to take these people that they designated as Black and then dehumanize the entire race in order for them to supply the large amount of labor that they needed for their tobacco plantations or their cotton plantations or their sugar plantations, whatever it was they were seeding. They needed to ensure that these brutes, as they called them, had the mental fortitude to understand their level of servitude. So now what you're doing is you're not only racializing a group, but now you're dehumanizing the group. And you're not only dehumanizing that group within communication one to another so that you can perpetuate the system, but you're also ensuring that the group is dehumanized so that they believe they are less. They believe that they are. Their goal in life is to be servant to the white supreme group. So the entire country is built on that system. There's no way around it.
There's no way around it. As a matter of fact, so what we are literally saying here is that capitalism in America, so capitalism is up and on its way. Capitalism in America was founded on and developed on the backs of Black slaves who provided free labor.
Most definitely.
Very clear. So
that's it.
When we get to tomorrow night's conversation, we start talking about pathway forward. I want to deal with the issue of reparations, which I have never even wanted to have that conversation because, I always thought that's not going to lead anywhere. It's only going to lead, irritate white folks. It's only going to make them angry. Folks aren't going to buy into that. But now it's a matter of whether it happens or not. It is a matter of to me, spiritual principle to just at least have the discussion.
Most definitely.
Most definitely. When we get to the part we talk about when you go into any American city and you drive and you go to the black neighborhood, you go to the white neighborhood, and you see the glaring disparity of wealth. That didn't just happen because some people work hard and some people didn't.
No.
That is deeply rooted in this entire system that goes back for generations. So it is very clear that our audience, that you hear that the American capitalism began and developed on the backs of black slaves and the free labor that they provided for the system. Okay. Yolanda, you were about to say something?
Did you hear, or have any of you had the opportunity to hear Kimberly Latrice Jones, who has used the Monopoly game to discuss the 400 years of slavery and basically what you were just saying, Pastor Johnson, how capitalism has basically made it to a point to where African-American people can never get ahead. I don't care how far we've come, we can never get ahead.
Wow.
So she talks about, and maybe we'll research this a little more and talk about it tomorrow night, but she talks about the game and how if you were playing Monopoly and for the first 400 rounds, you weren't able to play.
Right.
And then once those 400 rounds were over, the rules always had to be based off of how everyone else who had already been playing decided for them to be. And those rules were always against you. So just the analogy that she gives in using this game to, in layman's terms, just make it hit home how we've been put behind so far that our children's children won't have the benefit of any of the labors of our ancestors.
Unless we redress.
Unless we address it. Black people in this country make 60% of the wealth. They hold 60% of the wealth of white people. Why? Because in order for us to receive wealth, the way the system is built, we have to be given that wealth from those who are in power. We have to be given those opportunities. Or we have to be in a position where we can get into the same seats as those who are giving the power.
Exactly.
So that's where the policies start to change, because the whole goal of racialized capitalism, we're not talking about just capitalism. We're talking about American capitalism, which is racialized capitalism.
Yes.
The concept of racialized capitalism is there is always an under and there's always an over. Those who are over, those who are under. And so in our case, Black people in this particular system our legs have been broken right out from under us. There was never a post-slavery plan in this country. Never. Slavery was to be a permanent institution in this country that would feed the pockets of the elite white few. That was the goal, or the white majority, which now that's shifting. So that's another interesting direction. Maybe we can go there tomorrow night.
Yeah.
Can we say real quickly? So I know Rachel has given us some history. Can you all, Yolanda gave us a resource, and her name again is Kimberly Latrice Jones, if you want to go ahead and look her up. Rachel, do you want to give a resource that folks can go back and do more reading or research on their own? Is there a book that you will refer us to? Dr. Shana, there are a couple of books that you and I discussed. You want to list a couple of those, and I think if you mention them, I'm ready to put them on to do a screen share and let folks see what those books are, so that folks can go back, because we're moving so fast. We're moving so.
Yes.
We're saying so much.
Yes.
And so we want folks to be able to go back and do some research on their own. So if you all mention those resources, we'll pull them up and show them to folks real quick.
Well, the biggest one is, for me, everyone should read Stamped from the Beginning by Dr. Ibram X. Kendi. It's a definitive history of racist ideas in America. And if you start with that, it's a big read, but if you start with that, it'll give you a very concise, very comprehensive look into how racist capitalism was built in America. It is a fantastic book. It is very well thought out. The whole resource is just fantastic, very well written. And so it has become a very important resource for me. So I would say Stamped from the Beginning, if you can start with that. And then I also believe that every person in America, whether you are white, black, brown, doesn't matter, should read White Fragility. White Fragility, Why It's So Hard for White People to Talk About Racism, by Dr. Robin DiAngelo. It is a fantastic book. She dives right into the biggest issue. The biggest issue that we have is if we can get the white people in this country to understand the parameters and the deep set history of racialized capitalism in this country, we change it. Now, there's some other things we have to do, but if you read this resource, I think it'll be huge for you. So that's White Fragility by Dr. Robin DiAngelo. And then the third one that I would refer people to is How to Be an Anti-Racist by Dr. Ibram X. Kendi. So we have White Fragility, and we have How to Be an Anti-Racist by Dr. Ibram X. Kendi. The reason I like How to Be an Anti-Racist is because it is his story related to his own racism as a Black man in America, and how we can employ anti-racist ideas so that we can in turn create anti-racist policies. So those are the three resources that I would recommend to begin with. And I'm knee deep in all three of them right now, as well as some other sources. But Stamped from the Beginning has saved me hours and hours of research.
Awesome. And I will refer to people to, in terms of where we are now, a classic, Cornel West, both of the books that Dr. Shana has already mentioned, but I would mention Cornel West, Race Matters, particularly the chapter entitled The Pitfalls of Racial Reasoning. So that book, that chapter helped me. Once we do the analysis of race, once we talk about how where we've been, where we are, and how we get beyond it, then that chapter, he does such a great job of how even we as African Americans have to be very careful that we function as human beings, as full human beings in the human project, and not get into the pitfalls of racial reasoning. And he gives an example of that's why Black folks and Black leaders were totally hushed at the appointment of Clarence Thomas, because they fell into the pitfall of racial reason. So he's a Black guy. So we like Black folks on the Supreme Court. So what do we do about this? Rather than judging on the matter of principle and morality and ethics. And so that I would recommend that book, along with the two books that Dr. Shana has already mentioned. Rachel, Yolanda mentioned the resource from Kimberly Latrice Jones. Rachel, you have a resource you want to mention to us?
The first thing I have to say is definitely agree. You've got to read White Fragility. That's got to be a starting point for every white person. And because there are a lot of resources about the systemic racism and different aspects of that, mass incarceration, Just Mercy, you can watch the movie, but you can also read the book for the bigger story. But White Fragility really gets into where it's the day-to-day interactions. Why it's so hard, it harkens back to this issue of humility again. How do we have humility? What I think is challenging, and the reason I'm so thankful to be here tonight, is that we don't often have resources, or we don't hear about as many resources that make the connection between faith and racism, the church and racism, and how do people of faith address these issues. I mean, I think that's where you have to go. You have to dig in deeper, and reading the Bible from the margins by Miguel de la Torre is one that's a broader than just specifically Black experience, white experience, but especially for white readers, anything that is going to decenter you, any resource that is going to put you outside of the white way to read the Bible is the right way to read the Bible. There is no white way. It's just the way we always have read it. Everyone reads it that way, right? So until you have started to read from a different perspective, just soak it in. Even you don't really have to do that much at first. You just are listening. I think those kinds of resources, they're very accessible. It's not a big, heavy, White Fragility is a very heavy book. It is very difficult intellectually, but the Bible, it's the same Bible. Just listen to someone else talk about how they read it differently. And that's something that I think people of faith can begin to approach no matter where you feel like you are. You don't have to be so intimidated by some of these other books. And I know there are other resources. You mentioned Cornel West, but there are so many theologians, Will Gaffney, Howard Thurman, that if white people would just read a theologian who isn't white, that would be a start. Anyone, almost anyone, just start somewhere. And sometimes that kind of reading is more approachable, as a place to start that isn't so intellectually challenging. So you can be more in tune with what you're feeling. And that maybe that's more important actually in the work, is being more in tune with what you're feeling and how you're responding and paying attention to those things and thinking about, gosh, is that also how I'm responding in those conversations with my neighbor, or, in the other work that I'm asking people to do on my behalf. So those are my off the top of my head suggestions.
So I would like to. So this is what we're gonna do. So it is 8:28. Man, how fast time moved. So what I like to do is, so that's my email address. I want to put that up. And if you're watching and you have questions for our panelists, if you will send those questions to me, and I will get those questions to these persons, and they'll have a chance to read over them and prepare for our discussion on tomorrow night. So we left the African continent and we got to the American soil, and we met and with the convergence of Black bodies, financial greed, religious supremacy, and racial supremacy. And now those four things are going to come together to create the unique American story. So we will pick up there tomorrow night. So Dr. Shana, if you'll be prepared to pick up from that point and then take us through slavery, Reconstruction, post-Reconstruction, which, by the way, I don't know if you all have read Ta-Nehisi Coates. He does such a marvelous job. Well, Louis Gates does as well, of talking about how what we're living through now in the Trump years is really almost a revisiting of the same thing that happens in post-Reconstruction, that there's a period of Black progress. There's a period of people thinking, okay, we're moving beyond the issue of race, only to have this horrible backlash. And of course, we're praying that the same things that happened then don't happen now, Yolanda. It feels that way. It feels very much like we're on the brink of just ugly violence and division, but hopefully we can take some steps to avoid that. So we'll come through that. Then we'll talk about the African-American participation in the world wars, that participation that has often been ignored, and then how the redlining districts happen, and we'll come all the way up until the place where George Floyd has a policeman's knee on his neck and he's crying for his mom, and then we'll talk about how to go forward. So I'd like to spend 45 minutes finishing up the history. I know that's a lot. So what we'll do, Doctor, is let's provide resources, and if possible, we may even ask her when we get to the point of even doing our go forward strategy to provide some tools that people can find on Google. What do you call it, Rachel, that we use with Kifa?
Zoom. Are you thinking Zoom?
Well, Google,
Or the Google Drive,
Google Drive, that we can post some stuff on Google Drive that folks can go and they can have those resources. And then, of course, I already know that we will have to continue beyond tomorrow night and come back together and do more. So thank you all so much for tuning in. It's 8:31. Dr. Shana, you want to close us out and then kind of set us up for tomorrow night?
Yes, of course. The thing that we have to remember going forward in the conversation is that whenever racism is at work, there's always a motivation for racism. So in our case, the motivation was capital gain, pretty much, and religious freedom, but capital gain really led this whole thing. So racist ideas create racist policies. So because there was never a plan for post-slavery, we are seeing a evolution of those racist policies throughout the history that we're going to cover tomorrow. It's from 1444 all the way through to 2020. Racist policies that have to continuously evolve in order not to upset the system in America.
Wow. So much fun. This has been so much fun, so informative. I hope all of our guests, I saw we had a steady group tonight here, at least on one platform I'm looking at, that folks stayed on and watched. And so I hope you were tonight was helpful. It's going to be even better tomorrow night as we continue the story and then get to that place where we begin to provide what I consider a practicable plan for moving forward, a practicable strategy for moving forward. Again, I want to thank Pastor Yolanda for joining me on last minute requests. Thank you so much. And thank you for listening. We'll be back on tomorrow night at 7 p.m. God bless. Thank you.
Yes, thank you.
Good night. Thanks.